In this video, we're going to go over control flow and cover if statements, while, do-while loops, for loops, enums, and switch cases. So an if statement, it allows us to tell our program how to respond. It could be based on some user input, some feedback, or conditions we write in ourselves. So say with that, say you're programming a snake game. If the user presses the up button, we want the snake to go up. And if they press the right arrow button, we want the snake to turn right. So the general structure often if statement looks like this, like if some condition, or it could be comparison, then some action or do something, else do some other action instead. And of course, this is an actual code, which is why I commented it out. But let's try out a simple example. Say we have a fruit. And now let's write our if statement. So when we run this, we love avocados because our fruit was an avocado. And if we want to change fruit to say orange, then we would have, let's change it to orange. And now let's run. Now we print out the else statement because our fruit is not an avocado. And also we can catch multiple conditions by adding else if. So let's say we have an int and now let's write the if statement. So here we see by catching multiple conditions and adding else if statements, we're branching out our code. And when we run, we have young person. So in the first video, we talked about relational operators. We also have logical operators. So we have not equal to, or, and we can use these along with our relational operators to form more complex logical statements. So let's combine some of the logic from our previous if statement. So let's say, and fruit is equal to orange. Remember, we changed our fruit. Then we want to print, we have a young person and an orange. Else, we want to print no young person and no orange. And when we run this, we have a young person and an orange. Now say we change one of these and say we put age as being greater than 20. Now when we're printing out our if statement, then we're getting no young person and no orange. And so this whole statement has evaluated to false. So we see that for when we're using and, the and operator, both conditions need to be true for us to execute what's inside. Now, if we switch this and we use or, this whole statement will now evaluate to true because at least one of the conditions is true. In our case, fruit will be equal to orange. And so when we run, we have a young person. Here we could have changed it to or an orange, but just so we see that for the and operator, both conditions need to be true for the whole statement to evaluate to true, whereas with the or operator, only one condition needs to evaluate to true. Okay, so now depending on the expression you're comparing or evaluating, it's possible you may have a lot of branches or else if statements. In our previous example, we could have added conditions to catch maybe when we have a baby or an adolescent and so on. But then we would end up with a long if statement, which uses more words and it could just look a little messier. So instead, we could use a switch statement, which simplifies the if statement. But to use it, we need to have an expression or a case that we're evaluating. So if we use the same example as before, I'll just comment out our code for now to give ourselves more room. Okay, so we have our age. Let's set it to 75 for now. Switch. Okay, so this is our switch statement. We use break to exit out of the whole switch statement because the code in the case statement would have been evaluated. So in this case, let's say the age was actually 17, then we would have printed young person and then exited out of the switch statement, and we wouldn't continue. And we also add defaults to our switch statement so that we can catch any values that aren't given in our cases. But here we see that the switch statement is a little easier to read compared to the if statement we had before. So right now, if I want to know what block gets executed, say when age is 34, I can easily take a look at the case and see that adult person would be printed. And just a quick note, when using switch statements, you can only use the equality operator. You cannot necessarily use any greater than or equal to signs and try to do ranges. Otherwise, you would have to use the if statement. So in this example, we were using just an int like our age as the value that we were evaluating, but we could just as easily have used a string. And when we use strings, we can make use of enumerated types, or enums for short. For now, let's say, let's just use a simple switch statement. So let's say we have an employee, say Dwight. Now let's create our switch statement. So when we run this, we get salesman. Oh, I had forgotten to run for int. We had got an older person. But yeah, when we run this, we get salesman. And notice how in this example, I have a case statement without a break here. And so what happens is, like, all the case statements that are next to each other in this manner, they're bundled up and we get to execute the code here, which is why we got salesman. Now let's create an enum that holds the names of the Dunder Mifflin employees. For now, I'll just comment this out. And of course we could add other people, but for now, maybe we'll just assume these are employees and they opened another branch or something. But we can now use the switch statement this way. And remember, you always need to have a case that you're evaluating. And this will be our case. We want to find Dwight. Okay, we got salesman. Okay, so far we've gone over the if statement, switch statements, and enums. So now let's get into for loops. So for loops allow us to iterate over some code however many times we want to go over it. So if you think of your own body, there are a bunch of processes that are being repeated over and over again. You can think of how your heart is continuously beating and pumping blood to your whole body, and maybe like our digestive system, we eat, food gets digested, and some of the food gets passed out, and some of it gets absorbed as nutrients. And so like all these examples, these are like examples of iterative processes. So sometimes when we're programming, we want to repeat some steps for a certain number of times. And a quick example of using for loops, let's comment this out. Say we want to print numbers from 0 through 7. So let's just quickly type and then go over the structure. Okay, so we start off with 4, and then inside the bracket we first initialize or create the counter variable, and then we set the condition. Here we want I to be less than 8 since we're printing up to 7, and then we increment our variable so that after every iteration the value of I is being updated. In this case we're incrementing by 1. So when we run, here we see we have our numbers from 0 to 7. Now let's say for this example we wanted to print every number from 0 to 7, but we wanted to skip over the number 4. Then we can use the continue keyword to skip over an iteration. So I'll add the following code. Okay, so now when we run, we see that 4 has been skipped over. Now, if you're familiar with coding in Python, then you know about list comprehensions. And in Dot, you don't have list comprehensions, but you have the for in loop, which to me kind of reminds me of list comprehensions because you don't need to create a counter variable to go over whatever you're iterating. So let's say we have a loop. Oh, actually, let's say we have a list of names. And we'll talk more about lists later, but here's an example of a list of names. And let me just comment this out. Okay, so names is the list that we have already defined here, and the in keyword, it allows us to iterate over this names list, and for each iteration, this name variable that we have here, it is being assigned the value of a member of this list. So for the first iteration, the name was Tariro, and then for the second iteration, we have Tadiwa. And so that's why we have like our output listing out all the names that are in the list like this. And we can also simplify this further by using forEach loop. So using the same example that we have, we can actually write, I'll comment this out for now. Okay, and you notice that in this case we didn't declare or create this variable name, but that's because that can infer the type of name, and it's given the type of the contents or the members of our list. So name is of type string since we have strings in this list. So we've looked at for loops. Now let's take a look at another type of loops, while and do while loops. and I'll just comment this out. While and do while loops. And the basic structure of a while loop looks something like this. I'll put it in a comment. So while some condition then do something. So this is just to give us an idea of the general structure of a while loop. So we can have a loop that looks like this. While true, then we want to print we run this. So this is an infinite loop because the condition will always be true, and so the loop will just continue executing. So I'll actually just manually stop this. And you wouldn't want to create an infinite loop unless maybe you're programming the heart of a human being or something like that. But now let's create a more practical while loop. So the first time we have points equal to 11, which is less than 25. And so we increment points by 5. And so we get 16, which is what we have printed. And for the second iteration, point is now 16, which is still less than 5. And we increment again by 5, and then we print 21. But then after the third iteration, points is now 26, which makes the condition false here. And so nothing gets executed. Now for do while loops, they're essentially while loops with the do statement added at the beginning, such that the code will always execute at least once. So the general structure looks something like this. So if we look at our while loop here, if we had set our variable to say 26, then we wouldn't have had anything executed. Let me set it to 26. And that's because the initial condition is false, so we don't even go through the loop. But let's now convert it to a do while loop. So let's have our points. We've already set our points as 26. So now we see points is 31, and this is because the do statement is executed before we check for any condition that is in the while loop. So a do while loop will always get executed at least once. And of course, if we set it to 11 points, then the do while loop will just give the same results as the first time. Let me set it. But you got to see the main difference between a while loop and a do while loop. And just a quick side note, we can add the break statement to break out of a loop or stop the code from running. So let's say, going back to our infinite loop, say, right, so without the break statement, this would just be another infinite loop, since the condition here will always be true. But when we add the break statement for the given condition, that is if num is greater than 25, then the loop will stop after that point. Okay, so that is it for this video. We have looked at an if statement, switch cases, and enums, for loops, while, and do while loops. And we've also seen how we can use continue and break statements to skip over or break out of our code. In the next video, we'll look at functions in Dart. Thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you in the next video.